My name is Lisa Snell from the Reason Foundation, and I've been working on school finance for a few years. And today we are going to talk about a topic that usually makes most people's eyes roll into the back of their head. It's not the most interesting, or if you will, the most sexy topic in education reform. Although, arguably, these folks would probably disagree with me. So today we're going to talk about a topic that we don't usually deal with, which is what happens to the money after the state has given it to the school district. So most of our school finance reforms tend to focus on how will we change the state formula, are we spending enough? We talk about, but we don't usually talk about once the school district gets the money, is it being used in an effective, efficient way that is actually connected to performance or outcomes for students in any way? And that's really what we're going to focus on today is school-level transparency. And I'm going to start with just a little story. I'm from California, and I've been working on a project looking at the fiscal outlook of the Los Angeles Unified School District. And Los Angeles School District is the second largest school district in the United States, and it's currently serving about 500,000 students. 10 years ago, it was serving almost 200,000 more students. And since 2014, when the governor developed a new state-level school finance formula, Los Angeles has lost 55,000 students in 4 years. Now, many of those students have gone to independent charter schools in Los Angeles, but it still only accounts for about 35% of the district's loss of students that have gone to charter schools. So the rest of the students have left because it's expensive to live in Los Angeles, the birth rate has declined, there's other school districts nearby that are more attractive, private schools, name your reason, homeschooling, but the district has lost a lot of kids over time. In California, we developed a new school funding system that Jerry Brown, one of the best things that he's done as governor, called local control funding formula. And it actually, for the first time, means that more than one person in the state of California can understand how schools are financed. And basically, it gives a base transparent funding amount to all students, and then it weights for foster care, English language, and low income, and you can't double count, and then you get a concentration weight if you have over a certain level of low income students. And it actually really does make it easy to understand, and it's leveled the playing field between charter schools and regular students in California. But basically what's happened in Los Angeles is between 2014 and 2017, 2018, their revenue per student has gone from about $9,000 to about $15,000 per student, and their expenditures have gone from about $9,000 to about $15,000. They're serving 170,000 to 200,000 students less, and they're still spending the exact amount of money. They actually have more employees. In 2018, 69,000 employees. In 2014, when they had 55,000 students, they had 65,000 employees. So they're growing, they're staffing up, and low-income foster care students and English language learners have basically driven about $4 billion in new revenue to the district in the last 4 years. But when you look at that money, the district was just sued by the ACLU because they counted $500 million that they spent on special education toward spending money on those weighted kids. The bottom line is that in Los Angeles Unified, in many districts, even though the governor's intent was to spend more money on low-income kids, at the school level, that money is not reaching them. LA hired new staff, they hired new police officers, they put librarians back in every single school. They did a lot of things with the new money, but they didn't actually spend much of it on low-income kids. And that's the reason that we want to talk about financial transparency at the school level, is when legislators have legislation that makes the funding system better, drives more money to the district, how do we know if the legislator's intent is being met and if schools are actually receiving, the students in those schools receive the money that? And certainly in California right now we're at a crossroads where we fixed the state funding system and yet low-income and disadvantaged kids are still not receiving more resources. So I'm now going to introduce our panelists, and that's kind of the frame. And I just want to say that Excellent and Education, they have the Foundation for Excellent Education. Sorry, I'm trying to get whatever the best way to describe our hosts down. They actually do have model legislation that you can all look to that describes some best practices if you wanted to deal with school-level transparency so you don't get into California's conundrum. On our panel, we have Marguerite Rosa, who's the Director of Economics Lab at Georgetown University, arguably knows more about school finance, is the one person in the nation that knows the most about school finance. We have Lori Taylor, the Director of the Mosbacher Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy at Texas A&M University. We have Luke Ragland, the President of Ready, Colorado, and we have Dave Belton, the representative from the Georgia House of Representatives. They are going to describe both how school finance is changing at the federal level and then talk about how they are working in each of their states to deal with this idea of financial transparency and school funding changes. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about their bios because it's so organized here. You have tons of information about each of the speakers. I'm going to turn it over to Marguerite.
So those of you who know me know that we're going to start with a quiz. Well, not really. What I'm going to talk to you about is the upside of financial transparency by school. But this would be the quiz question, and you better look interested because I just might call on somebody. If you think of a school near your house or where you live, and you decided you wanted to figure out how much was spent all in public funds on the kids who go to that school. And maybe I would give you the rest of the day to figure it out. And you'd look up online, and you'd look at the district, you'd look at the state website, and chances are, probably at least 90% of you would not be able to figure out that number because at least 90% of that information is not available anywhere. And this is sort of what you would look like, I think, by the end of the day, we would say, because you can't get your hands on that number. And that's because we don't actually count the money by school. We don't say Maple Leaf Elementary spends $13,000 a pupil. What we do is we say how much the district spends. And then we say how much the district spends on instruction or administration or things like that. So the number isn't there. And it's fascinating for lots of reasons we'll talk about in a second. But my next quiz question for you is, who decided how to spend all that money? We have $600 billion or so in public education funds in this country. Who chose how to spend it? The answer to that one is school boards. The interesting thing is that if you have a room full of school board members and you ask this question, they say, wait, us? No, it's not us. And that's another thing, is that they're not even aware of how the money inside their districts, what it purchased, which schools got it, and so on. And I just want to point out that this is kind of a glaring omission to date. We've had outcomes by school for years with No Child Left Behind. We started measuring outcomes by school. And principals and school board members and school district officials, they're pretty aware of what the outcomes are by school. But what we haven't had is this spending amount. How much are we spending by school? And without both sides of that equation, you really can't do much with the outcomes. So let me show you what that looks like for a minute. If we look at a couple of different schools here, this is a scatter plot, and you're thinking, did she really bring like a scatter plot for us to digest? But bear with me a second. On the horizontal at the bottom is spending, and this is in Washington State a few years ago. It's all the high poverty elementary schools in the state. We got rid of the really small ones and the really big ones. But these are all schools that are high poverty elementary schools. And on the vertical is math performance, but the graph looks about the same if you put reading performance or anything else. It's a big scatter plot, right? So we don't first of all, we're not seeing a really robust relationship between spending and outcomes. If we did, all the dots would be kind of clustered more and sort of upwardly sloping. But it's sort of all over the map at the moment. But if you look at C and B, they're both high-performing, relatively speaking, poor schools. But one is expensive, and the other one is really not. And if you look at D and A, they're both really low-performing schools. And yet, A is a school that's got more money than its peers, and D doesn't. And the answer for what to do about the school is very different, right? One has a lot of resources, hasn't figured out how to use them. The other one is very much shortchanged from equity reasons. So we can't really have a conversation about performance without also having a conversation about money. And that's why these all go together. And frankly speaking, there are now a growing number of states working on building the financial transparency part of their websites and their information systems, and hats off to them. In fact, some of the ones that are early at this are at this table. We're going to hear about them, but also the reason behind a new provision in the ESSA law. So without much fanfare, was a short little sentence in there that said, state agencies are required to report spending by school. And so this is going to change. Everybody's going to be doing it. And it was a bipartisan feature of the law. It kicks in for the 2018-19 school year. And we're really excited to report that most states are working hard on coming up with this information. But there's a lot of work left to do, and it matters how the information is put together, and I'll show you what it can look like. This is an example of a visualization, same kind of spreadsheet, expenditures on the horizontal, outcomes on the vertical. You have high spending, high outcome schools in the upper right, lower right, high spending, lower outcome schools, and so on. But you also have a set of filters down the right-hand side. And that means if you're a principal or a school district leader or a parent, you could say, I want to compare my schools, maybe to other schools in my district, maybe to other rural, low-income schools, or maybe to other more affluent suburban schools, or who knows what. Maybe to schools that are about the same size as mine, but also have a large percentage of the students who are bilingual ed students. How am I comparing? And now you have relevant comparisons that couple both financial data and outcome data. And then you can say, I want to benchmark how I'm doing. I want to figure out how, which schools I might want to pick up the phone and call that are figuring out how they're beating the odds with similar resources that I have. I want to go back and talk to my staff, my faculty, and say, you guys, we have similar amount of resources to our peers, but we're at the bottom of this graph. We've got to figure out how to roll up our sleeves and do more with the money that we have. And those are the kinds of things you can get from this data. Where there's a school, we call them the ROI superstars, that's beating the odds for the kids that it has and doing so with about the same resources as their peers, we can learn what they're doing. We can spread the innovations. Those are innovations worth spreading. But they don't pop up in the data right now. So I'll just point out, there's a lot of purposes for this data. Lisa completely erred by saying this is not an interesting topic. She was just flat out wrong. It is, and it's a game changer. We're excited about it. With more financial transparency, we'll get visibility on whether the funds are divvied up fairly inside districts. We assume there'll be greater demand for equity as a result of that. We anticipate seeing the spread of innovation. We can learn from those that are able to drive greater benefits for students. And each school can benchmark their progress by how well they're leveraging their dollars and engage with their communities about the trade-offs at hand. And we think that's especially exciting right now and something that's very much missing. So you'll hear that when we ask a principal how much is spent at your school, principals don't know. We haven't cut them in on this information, which means they can't leverage it to do the most with that information. They can't talk to their teams about what they're spending and what the trade-offs are. So as you in your states work on this, you'll know it's important to make smart choices in metrics. It'll be really critical to have excellent visualizations that both pair spending and outcomes. You want searchable, filterable systems that highlight, that can be used by the public, and we'll need training. So we're going to need school board members to know how to use this information. We're going to need principals to know how to use this information, and so on. So I'll leave it there for our next speaker. So I think you click it one more time and your slides will come up. Woo-hoo.
Thanks, Marguerite, and thanks, Lori.
And I click it one more time. Well, I really love everything Marguerite had to say, because I can just say, yeah, me too. And that will work with the slide that I've got at the moment. But I've been asked to provide you with two pieces of information. One's to talk a bit about financial transparency in Texas, which is the state where I work now, where I'm raising my kids. And then what one of the projects that I've been associated with for a number of years is doing to enhance financial transparency in the state of Texas. Texas is, as you may or may not know, a relatively large state. But our school districts tend to be relatively small. The median district in the state is around 1,000 students. We have school districts with less than 100 kids in them. And then we have Houston Independent School District with more than 200,000 students. So we have a big range of size. And since 1991-92, they have been reporting school-level spending data to the state, and those data have been available to the public on the state education agencies' websites for download. And that sounds like it ought to be transparent, but it's not. And the reason why it's not is because they're in a big honkin' zip file that has over 1 million data records. Excel just completely chokes on a data file of that size. It's campus-level spending at the fund, function, object, and program level. It's incredibly rich. It's really been helpful to the research community and borderline inaccessible to the rest of the community. The school-level analysis just hasn't been out there. And that's one of the reasons why I've become involved with what we call the Texas Smart Schools Initiative, which is an online resource to do exactly what Marguerite was talking about, to allow schools to benchmark themselves against other schools with similar circumstances in similar kinds of labor markets, and to evaluate and to allow taxpayers and school administrators to evaluate the quality of their education relative to what's being spent in those schools. The idea is to improve education by identifying schools that are both effective and efficient, and then highlighting their successful practices so other schools can learn from their ideas. This is just a quick screenshot of the website. This is available to the public to do those kinds of comparisons exercises that Marguerite was talking about. It comes out of a project that the Texas legislature tasked our Controller of Public Account to identify school districts and campuses that use resource allocation practices that contribute to high academic achievement and cost-effective operations. And so the former Controller of Texas, Susan Combs, and her team, and I was very privileged to be part of that team, developed the Financial Allocation Study for Texas, or the FAST, to meet that challenge. And the Texas Smart Schools Initiative grew out of the FAST program. There was a change in administration. The new controller didn't want to continue the resource devotion to the FAST program. Controller Combs wouldn't let it go. So with her own funding, she got us established, gave us 5 years of resources, and then kicked the baby out of the nest. And we're out there trying to fly on our own these days. But we're basically a project to continue this work that started in the legislature in 2009. The philosophy is that there are differences in educational context that have to be taken into consideration to make fair comparisons among schools and districts. And there are two important dimensions for those comparisons: academic progress and real expenditures. We've developed a measure of academic progress that we're quite proud of. It's a value-added measure of student gains on the Texas accountability instruments, adjusted for differences in prior performance and key student characteristics, so that when you're trying to see who to emulate, You want to if you're a school that has a large fraction of economically disadvantaged kids, you don't want to be trying to adopt the practices of a school where all the parents have PhDs. You want to be adopting the practices of a school that does particularly well with the kind of kids that you're dealing with in your world. And so we're looking at our measures of academic progress adjusted for prior performance and student characteristics to try and tease out what impact the school is having on the performance of these kids. On the spending side, we observed that each school or district is in a unique situation, but there are a lot of other neighbors that are really similar in a variety of the key characteristics that drive educational cost. Size, labor cost. It costs more to hire teachers in Houston than it does in Dalhousie, Texas. And a student need. It costs more to serve kids with high mobility and kids with a large fraction of economically disadvantaged students in that school. And so we're going to measure spending at the school and district levels relative to the spending of fiscal peers. We're going to build our spending index in Texas on operating expenditures per pupil in core educational functions. I share this list with you because it's important to the folks who are operating schools in Texas to recognize that what we're doing here is focusing in on those resources that are brought to bear in the school and in the classroom. And we're going to provide to that community a graphic that prevents information in the following way. I constructed this from our website looking at San Antonio Independent School Districts as the red dot on this diagram. The spending is reverse coded, so as you go from light to dark, you're doing a better job on performance and a better job on being frugal, so that your spending is relatively low, your performance is relatively high. San Antonio ISD has work to do. Okay, they tend to not perform particularly well by our standards. We have constructed a set of comparison school districts that we think are the appropriate peer group for comparison. If you don't like that one, pick your own. Our website allows you to make any comparisons. It allows for the filtering that Marguerite was talking about, and allows people to drill down and see not only what's going on at the school level, but more importantly, perhaps what's going on at the campus level. In the Texas spending data, there is some variation in how the school districts themselves decide to account for things like central administration and maintenance, security, and data processing. Some districts do that centrally. Some districts push that out to the school level. When constructing our campus level metrics, we focus in on those parts of spending that we believe are going to be essential and core to the campus level experience: instruction, instructional leadership, school leadership, and student support services, which in Texas are largely delivered at the school level. And that allows us to basically use our website to pick a campus that you want to look at. You can look at our set of peers, you can pick your own set of peers, compare it, identify who's doing a good job with what. This is an illustration looking specifically at Arcadia Park Elementary, which is the red dot surrounded by our proposed set of fiscal peers. Arcadia Park Elementary is doing quite remarkably well. Their student performance is in the just outside of the top quintile, and definitely in the top quartile, and their spending is in the middle of the pack amongst their professional peers. There's someone to look to for advice and guidance. There are people that are outperforming them, so they can look to others for insight. But it's really been our observation that school districts don't listen to academic professor types all that much, but they'll listen to each other. And what our tool allows them to do is identify who's been able to hit it out of the park, who's been able to get there from here with the existing level of resources. And those are the people that we hope they will start listening to. And what we hear anecdotally is that that is who they are listening to, that it's leading to change in Texas as districts learn not just who's performing well, but who's performing well while remaining frugal. And that is what's going to happen to have progress in a constrained resource environment like the one we operate in right now. So this is another, if you want to look at a Kamal ISD or Canyon Lake High School, Kamal is one of the school districts that's really gotten their school board excited about what the Smart Schools website has to offer to them, and really pays attention to changing their curriculum and adopting new practices in order to be able to improve. When we started our analyses, they were bottom of the barrel, middle of the pack. Nowadays, they are knocking the socks off of everything, and we couldn't be more proud. I'd like to just kind of finish with saying the Smart Schools academic project measures augment the extensive Texas accountability system with a value-added measure of student academic progress that's not available currently in the literature, so we make a contribution there. The Real Spending Index allows comparisons among districts and schools that face the same sorts of challenges. And perhaps most importantly, the website and the tool shows schools that it's possible to accomplish more than they already do without an increase in resources if they adopt the best practices of other schools and districts in the state.
Thanks so much, Lori. And now we're going to hear from Luke.
Great, thanks. My name's Luke Ragland. I'm the president of Ready, Colorado. We are a conservative education reform organization based in Denver. I think it's important to note, though, that while I worked on this policy 3 years ago, I was actually at a different organization that cares deeply about this called Colorado Succeeds, and I'm sure we have some Colorado Succeeds people here. And so it's still relevant, and thankfully I'm still relevant, or I hope I am. I want to talk a little bit about where we're at in Colorado, what we've done, some of the good and the bad as an early adopter of this sort of model. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about advocacy strategies and some of the political roadblocks or challenges that I think are likely when folks approach this sort of strategy, and why even that matters. So where is Colorado at? 3 years ago, we passed a financial transparency requirement as part of an omnibus spending package that included a variety of items, but this was a key component of that. Required reporting of school site level budgets, including actual salaries and benefits by job type, publishing all this information on a website that could be easily used by a layperson. I think Marguerite's point on that is really critical. I'm a big believer in bringing data to the people, and I think that if the data is there but it's not accessible or useful for folks, it doesn't really mean much. The language we use in this statute is clarity and comparability by laypersons. You can go, I'm not going to give you the website because I don't want you looking at it while I'm talking, but I'll give you the website and you can check it out a little bit on your own. Importantly, and this is a different angle that hasn't been explicitly talked about, but it was really important in Colorado, was transparency into charter school finances. Particularly the relationship between charter schools and their districts. In Colorado, we have a district authorizing structure, and districts charge charter schools for special education services as just one example of many services. That was a complete black box for those charter operators. They would get a bill, and they didn't really know exactly if that bill was justified or accurate or what it was for. So the bill also required that districts have to account for every special education and other charges that they levy against their charter schools. And then even more importantly, it required a clear delineation of all additional local tax revenue that's raised by a school district, and then how much of that is shared with charter schools in their district. That became incredibly important because Colorado last year became the first state to require school districts to share 100% equitably with their local charter schools that they authorize. And that was only really possible actually because of this financial transparency requirement that we worked on 3 years prior. A couple of wrinkles that I think are really worth highlighting. Colorado, we like to experiment. We were just talking about that with the marijuana issue. We are a state that likes to experiment with things before other states. The data visualization was a key component of the folks who were really championing this, and I think that part of the website is really quite wonderful. I'm a big fan of it, and maybe you can take a look at it and judge. I think that the visualization is quite good. We used a private vendor. That was part of the process. The governor in particular really wanted to use a private vendor, a public-private partnership. But not all costs, when the website first came out this year, after a long sort of delay, there were some issues for sure. I think the biggest one for me was that not all costs were really being pushed down to the school site level. And that was something that, we sort of, I think, overlooked in the statute, and I think is just such a critical component of when you're working on this, whether it's through a partnership model or legislation or with your State Board of Education. I think that's really, really critical. In Colorado, we also don't have an explicit tie-in with performance, which I think is another gap. And I think, obviously, advocates like myself will be making those comparisons, but I think having it as a one-stop shop would be a better way of doing it. Importantly, this was before the ESSA requirement, and I think that Marguerite is also very correct to say that changes things. What are some of the things that we want to do with this in Colorado? I think I'll just sort of agree with a lot of the things that were set up here, add the charter school piece as something. I think one of the initial things that I think is a great benefit that was unexpected was there is so much arguing about school finance, the source, the amounts, what's the trusted source, what's not, what's the real amount, what's not the real amount. And I think that it's starting to provide us with a platform to have conversations where it's a sort of known, trusted source. And I think that will help us moving forward with larger school finance discussions. Okay, so I really want to talk about the advocacy campaign and what are some of the roadblocks that I think are likely for folks, either legislators or advocates in the room who are looking to do this. I think that the legislative route is only one way to get it done, though, and the point about ESSA requiring this is critical. That provides a wonderful peg for either a legislative strategy to implement something like this, a state board strategy, or just a more collaborative strategy where you work with your school community to make this happen. I don't think that you can rely on that on its own, though. If you just rely on the fact that this is supposed to be reported, I think that it might technically get done, but I don't think it's going to be done in a way that's useful for folks, and it certainly won't probably include things like performance and some of the other things that these folks have highlighted. So I think an intentional plan to do something with this information to make it accessible and useful is really, really critical. I would say you should try an inclusive strategy first, sort of maybe don't go to the legislature right away to do this. I know that's sometimes a temptation. But I also am realistic that sometimes that's the way you have to do it, particularly if resources are necessary to implement a program. All right, so I want to talk about two things with the advocacy campaign. Messaging, some of the things, how we talked about this as a state that had a legislative fight over this issue, and then two, likely opponents or people who are going to have trepidations and how you can respond. So first on the messaging point, I think this is obviously messaging 101 for a lot of people in here, but you have to define what this is about before the other side does. If the argument is about whether low-income kids should receive an equitable share or whether the public has the right to know where their tax dollars are being spent, that's an argument that you can win as you're promoting this policy. If the argument quickly gets shaped as something as an unfunded mandate or whether the question is whether overtaxed school districts have the ability to respond to another unfunded mandate that doesn't matter, that's an argument you'll probably lose. And so I would say if you're approaching looking at implementing something along these lines, get out there first and define what this is about. Talk about all the uses that you've heard today, that this is a tool for improvement, that this isn't a tool to sort of play a gotcha game with school districts, but it's something that can be really a powerful tool in educators' hands. In a purple state like Colorado, you have to have an overarching, broad, bipartisan message, and you have to have targeted messages for each side. And I will talk about some of the ones that we used. I think these obviously could be built upon, but these are things that we used. The first was just that Colorado doesn't know how 43% of its general fund is spent. We could say that, and people couldn't really respond to Marguerite's quiz at the beginning. They couldn't answer how the biggest portion of its state budget was being spent, actually spent. They could say, well, it goes to this school district or that school district, but that's obviously not a very good answer, and it was something that the folks who were opposed to this couldn't really overcome. And then the second one is just about to improve education, we have to know to get ROI. I think that's a broad, relatable message that a lot of people can understand. Mike Johnston was a state senator at the time, and he was one of the big champions of this. And he would tell a wonderful story about his time as a principal. He was a high school principal, and his school's budget was $4.3 million. And he had control of about 60,000 of those dollars. And he would always joke in committee hearings and in the press, that allowed me to make such bold decisions as whether the pens were blue or black. And, it was kind of a ludicrous thing to think of, or to draw to people's attention that a principal is expected, that we expect so much of them in terms of improvement and trusting them with our children, but we don't trust them to actually run their school and manage their own budgets. I think opening this data up to principals is one of the most important components, but using that message is a critical tool for you. Thinking about the more partisan messages, with Republicans, we talked about that this is necessary to find wasteful spending. in places where inefficiencies are happening. With Democrats, we talked about this is a way to show where inequities are occurring in the system and where additional investment might be necessary to be successful. I think the beautiful part of this is that both of those can certainly be true, and that you can work with both sides of the aisle to do that. I'll highlight one very specific person who's actually in the room, State Senator Kevin Priola, if you could raise your hand, Senator Priola. He was a House member at the time. I bring him up because this seems like a mom and apple pie issue. Wow, who's going to oppose this? This was one of the nastiest and most contentious things that I had dealt with at the time in quite a while. At the time, House member Priola actually lost his leadership position for his staunch support for this proposal. So just to give you a sense of how important that was and how important Senator Priola was to that. So thank you again, Senator Priola. So who are the folks who are opposed to this? So I'm hinting that there's opposition, but like where's the pushback likely to come from? I think, of course, school districts and school boards are going to have some concerns, particularly if this is framed in the wrong way at the front end. We dealt with that in a couple of ways. They were worried about additional reporting burden. So something we did that was a part of our package was we actually went through the financial transparency requirements that existed currently and eliminated things that weren't useful tools for improvement. So the good example that I always bring up is check registers. Check registers are part of the open record in Colorado, and anybody can look at them if they want. But school districts are required to maintain an updated, scanned, visual, easy to find on their website photo of all check registers on an ongoing basis. I guarantee nobody ever looked at that. And again, they're public records. If somebody wants to look at them, they can. But it was a major burden. And that's just one example of things we went through and actually cut out components of the existing financial transparency framework that was really based on an old school model of financial transparency that's looking to root out corruption as opposed to improvement. The school districts are also going to be nervous about the data being seen as out of context or backlash on the amount. I think that you have to realize that, I mean, the reality, and school districts know this, is that when the public sees the amount of funding that's being spent, they're often surprised at the amount. They think that it's less, and that school districts are often afraid that they'd be less willing to support future increases in funding if the public knows that. I actually think that's exactly backwards, though. I think that the first step is entrusting the public with information about what's happening before you go ask them for more. And also, that's a very difficult argument for folks to make. Republicans? Okay, thanks. I'm getting the hook here from the Apollo. So I'll just say Republicans rurals are particularly difficult and something you need to keep an eye on. And then the teachers union was a major opponent of this, mostly for the pension issue. Pensions are a sensitive subject, obviously, and segregating out pensions was a step too far for them. So I'll leave it there, and we can get to some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. And then, last but not least, we have the representative.
Hi, my name is Dave Belton from the great state of Georgia. I was actually a school board member before I was a legislator, and one of my very good friends, after I won the election to the school board, sent me an email about a Mark Twain quote about the school board. He said, "In the beginning, God created the idiot, and then he perfected his creation by creating the school board." So I thought that was very, very apropos. So I really wanted to make sure when I was a school board that I did something different and kind of got some credibility. And what I did is I wrote a thing called Belton Bulletin. Every month I would send out an email about 4 or 5 pages long about what's going on in the schools. And I just felt it was very, very important that the people, the parents especially, understand what was going on in the schools. And I found very quickly, I tried to compare my schools with the different schools in Georgia and the different counties. And I found like I couldn't do that because it was very almost impossible to find this information about how we were being efficient. One example is we had a bus service, as all schools do, and we were being told that the buses were very, very efficient. And I learned that later on that we were actually very inefficient, that we were doing a terrible job with our buses. But I couldn't compare that from one other county. So I wanted to do that. And the way I did it is I stole from Texas. There's scorecard back there, and I wanted to try to create a financial, required per school spending and make that available to the parents. The first one, this prototype screenshot here, this is for the Atlanta public schools. But as you see, it's kind of hard to see because it's a very small font. But this is what the website is going to look like. The governor is going to put together. First line is material equipment, then salaries and professional learning and maintenance and construction. This is for the entire state. It's a $25 billion. And like Luke said, when I talked about this, I said, where's your $25 billion going? And the other legislators just couldn't answer that question. That's why it's so important that we talk about this. And as you see in the smaller font, it goes down to counties, and then it's going to go down to local school districts as well. The last shot I'm going to have here is we're going to break down this bill, this law that I passed. Is going to break down the spending for staff salaries and benefits, materials, equipment, non-staff support, professional development, facility maintenance, small capital projects. We're going to metric it down to schools and then school systems and have ratios with expenditures and revenues and all these different things. Budgets and revenues, again, we have categories for all this, including SPLOST, which is local tax digest. And we're also going to put this 5 years of completed audits on this. And what we did in Georgia is we're going to say that the governor is going to have his scorecard, and I hope it's going to look as cool as the one in Texas. But also, each individual school board is going to have to publish this information on a website if they have a website, on their website if they have a website. But the good thing about this is, what we kind of addressed Luke's problem is we're not going to make the school board figure this out. Where the Department of Education is going to get all the data and produce it and then and give it to the school board so they won't have that issue. I did not have a problem with this, this wrangling. I had almost unanimous support from legislatures. Almost no group was against it. Like Luke talked about, to the Republicans, I'd say this is it's efficiency. We want to make sure we're not being wasteful. To the Democrats, I talked about fairness and inequality. My school district was tiny, 4,000 students, but we have 100,000, 200,000 kids in some of these school districts, and a lot of these school districts are wondering if some schools are getting more money than the other ones. And so that was how I talked to them. And then I had almost unanimous support on every single vote I had. I really feel like it's important that we empower parents, have more eyes on this money. And if there are inequalities, then I want the parents to be able to see that, and I want that to be on the website of the schools so that they know that. And then finally, I'll talk about that. I think it's important that these districts own these numbers, they own these scores, and I think if they own them, that they'll take credit for them and try to improve them, and I think that's how you get better scores.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to
have some moderated questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So we've heard a lot of really good examples about the ways you might approach school-level transparency. And what I want to turn to now is a theme that came up is the ESSA is going to require that states report school-level transparency, but that's not the reason that we should report school-level transparency because there's a federal regulation. We should report it because we want to see how money is being spent to improve outcomes for kids. And so the question for the panelists, and I'm going to start with Marguerite, is what is the very most critical thing to put into this system? Not necessarily we need to know materials or, very specific categories, but what are we trying to do? Like a well-designed system under ESSA, or just because it's a good thing to do, what should it look like? What's the most important?
So I would say we have to resist the temptation to use the system for efficiency. The most critical element is outcomes. And I'll just give you a scenario. Let's say two schools spend the same amount of money, but one spends more on administration and less on instruction. The conclusion would be, many people will jump to immediately saying they should spend less on administration then and put that money back into the classroom. We can see they're spending more on administration and less on instruction. But without the outcomes, that is a premature decision, right? So if that school is spending more on administration and less on a category called instruction, yet it's used the same amount of dollars to get better outcomes with similar students, I say have at it. If you figure that out and that works and you've somehow got a bigger investment in administration and it's working, who am I to judge? And I think that's the why we first and most importantly need to connect this information to outcomes and resist the temptation to say that there is a right way to spend the money. So if we find a school that's spending a lot of money on sports and it's working, well, maybe I put my own kids in more sports. I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to sort of step back and let the people in the school figure it out. If it's not working, then we can refer these schools to some of their peers and say, look at your mix of expenditures and so on. But don't jump in with the sense that we have the right mixture in mind, but rather let the outcomes do the talking for us. And that's why we have to have the outcomes in there.
Okay, great. And Lori, what would you say from your experience?
I would completely agree with Marguerite that you have to bring the outcomes in there. I guess I would take it in a slightly different direction. In Texas, we have two data streams on the financial side. We have budgeted financial data and we have actual financial data. And I would advocate very, very strongly for making sure to focus on those actual financial data. What the budgeted financial data tell you is what the plan was. But the actual data tell you what really got spent. And the habit among Texas school districts, thinking that they're behaving conservatively, is to lowball their revenue estimates for their budget and maybe slightly overestimate what they're going to need to spend on the classrooms so that they can balance their budget, thinking that the revenues will be less than they're really in their heart of hearts expect. Then year after year, actual revenues come in above budgeted, and they go piff them away. They just spend it off because the revenue came in above budget and there's no oversight on how these additional dollars are going to be spent. Our work suggests that the school districts that are budgeting more accurately, in other words, their budgeted revenues match up with their actual revenues more closely, tend to be more cost effective than other districts. But it's crucially important if you're going to talk about fiscal transparency and financial accountability that you focus in on the actual outlays and not those budgeted ones.
So I would just follow up on what Lori's saying. In this project that I was just working on for Los Angeles Unified, the most important document was the closing of the books, not the school budget, where you could actually see that spending on salaries after you've lost 55,000 students went up by 200%, and it was year to year. In LA's case, they didn't lowball the numbers. They actually, in some cases, doubled the actual spending from what was in the budget. And in California, Oakland, lots of districts do this. And if you just went to their budgets, you would never know that in the end, they're blowing past, in a lot of cases, what they budgeted, or they may be lowballing and then spending the money. But that's very key, that you want to look at money spent in the end as your critical data point. Luke, what about you? What do you think from your experience is the most important thing?
Yeah, I love the things that were already said, and I would totally agree. I would just reiterate making sure that the data is useful to the greatest amount of people, that this is something that's accessible and useful. Like, you talked about Texas, how it's been sitting there since the 90s, but it's not until you came to make it useful that it really means anything to anybody. So I think that would be critical.
I just like to say that to me, transparency is its own reward. And I talked about this Belton bulletin thing, and I would talk about good and bad that was going on in Morgan County schools. And what that did, it got people to buy in. And they instead of being this weird group of people who spent all their money, they actually understood what was going on. And because of that, they had a much bigger buy-in. I think just the transparency aspect, people want to be able to find out. And when they do, they're usually a lot happier about it than because it dispels their preconceived ideas that we're wasting all their money because they can see it.
Okay, great. the next question that I would have for the panelist is, so the ESSA is going to require this, but how do you get either legislators or state boards of education or whoever would eventually implement either complying with ESSA or just making school finance more transparent? What's happening on the ground right now in terms of states? Are they actually taking this seriously? Are people going to do this work? I don't think the federal government has actually released yet the ESSA requirements to do this, or where are we and what are the obstacles?
Sure, I can give an update on that. So yeah, the language is in the law, so it's there. We don't have to wait on anything. And there is a letter from the department that says that the start date was effectively extended to the first year being 2018-19. So the financials collection's got to be in place soon. My research center, Genomics Lab, runs a network of state agencies. We have 38 state agencies represented who are working earnestly on meeting this requirement. And doing so without a lot of political fanfare. I would say they really see the value of this and are taking stock of the data systems that they have in place and trying to make sure that they can fill the holes in time and develop good visualization systems and to do this. So I think it's absolutely worth keeping an eye on and absolutely worth emphasizing the importance of and potentially getting some, training in place, because when it comes out, about the worst thing that can happen is that no one look at it. And the more people that look at it, probably the better it will get over time. So, we're hoping that people use it. We're hoping that principals log in and say, hey, a bunch of this money was spent on my school and I don't think it's working. I'd rather spend the money in this other way. Principals have not sort of been in the game on that, and we want them to get in the game and speak up on behalf of their students. So, I'm actually optimistic for the most part, I would say.
Okay, great, thank you. I guess going along with it then, in the panel's opinion, do we need then state legislation that gets a lot of attention, or is this something, I think what I heard you saying is that this could be done internally without drawing a lot of attention to it? So when the districts get a hold of this, if the state requires it, they'll have to do it, but what do the districts need to do in this scenario? Will there be pushback from them that it is another unfunded mandate? In your states, in Texas and Colorado and Georgia, how have the school districts responded to providing this information? Are they technically able to do it?
Nobody remembers anymore what the fight was back in the day when the adoption. I mean, they've been doing this for more than 20 years now. Very small districts comply, very large districts. Has become basically a process by which the data that the district needs for its own purposes, for its own governance of how the money is spent internally, is then shared with the state. And so there are some problems with consistency of definition that need to get worked out, but a lot of these data are useful to the districts themselves, and so sharing those districts with the state is a relatively modest lift. If you needed, there are lots of Texas school districts could tell you how it's done.
From the Georgia perspective, it's not going to cost us anything. The data is out there. It's not being collected, not being, and again, the Department of Education is putting together the website stuff. So the local school boards should not have a big problem with it. And if they did have a problem, it's because they're a big local school board and they have staff to do that. But if you're a little local school boards, it's not that big a lift. That's our perspective. And we got zero pushback.
Yeah, I just think there's not one way to skin a cat, and I think that your state, you need to evaluate the situation and see what's possible. I do think that thinking about an investment in terms of making something that's useful for people to use, though, that does cost some money to make a useful tool. And so thinking about when you might want to invest in things like that, I always like to say, sometimes states are increasing educational budgets. This is a great thing to pair an investment to make that, how is that additional money being spent when you're looking at what's happening in your state? So the timing there can be very helpful.
Margaret?
Yeah, I think we're hearing that districts are anxious, that they're nervous about it. And their first answers are like, well, people aren't going to understand why we spend the money that we spend, how we do. And we say, this is your chance to open that conversation. Right. Our advice for districts is to say to their communities, this is new for us too. We've not been in the habit of dividing our finances by school. We've been dividing them in these federal categories we've had for a long time. Right. So we're looking at this data for the first time with you, and we're happy to talk about it. We'd love to know your thoughts, and if there are changes that we need to make, let's talk about how to make those changes over time. And I think that is the best response for districts. If districts come out, saying I've got to button everything up, get it all clean, and then defend what I'm doing, there's likely going to be a fight. But if they come out with an honest, I'd like to have a conversation about it too, let's hear what you think, there's some surprises in here for us, then it's more likely to go well.
Okay, great. And then the last question would just be about the actual transparency. What we're really talking about here is a system that would make this data easily accessible to the public, to journalists, to policymakers. In the 38 states and in your own states, is that an important topic, like keeping in mind how eventually the consumers will be able to see the data and use the data? Is that part of the discussion?
Yeah, I know that states are thinking a lot about what the visualization looks like, but I think I want to make another cautionary statement. Is I don't want to overpromise that the financial data will have all the answers. It won't be that you'll log into the site and go, oh, we should spend our money exactly the way this other school does because they get higher outcomes. Chances are the other school might be spending their money the way you are right now. There might not be that many differences. They may be on the same salary schedule. You both might have a nurse. You both might be even using the same bilingual ed program. And yet they're getting better outcomes. Because schooling it's not as formulaic as many other industries. It's a very human-intensive endeavor, right? It's about relationships between people, students and teachers and communities, and kids are different and teachers are different, and all of that humanness matters a lot in the outcomes. And the point here, I think, with the financial data is not to sort of pretend that humanness doesn't matter, but to actually leverage it or to tap into it, to say, here's your school getting the same amount of money as your peers, and yet that some of them are getting better outcomes. How can you reach into that humanness and put it to work for your kids too? How do you sort of stop saying, we don't have this or we don't have that, and start saying, it's time we got to roll up our sleeves and figure this out? What stands in the way in our school of getting those same outcomes, and let's plow through that problem. So I guess I want to sort of caution someone who might think we're going to run out and create a prescription or a formula or something. It's really not the use of the data. It's to actually engage a lot of this humanness.
Great.
If I were just to chime in, I would also suggest that it needs to be approached cautiously if you're dealing with a state that has a lot of internal variation in terms of labor cost, like a California or a Texas, where you have some very expensive places to live, where you have to pay teachers substantially more than in other locations, that the raw data can be useful, but some appropriately adjusted data looking at the purchasing power of those payroll dollars can be really important, because you can look like you're spending a lot on teachers in a location in the state where labor costs are particularly high, but actually able to staff the classroom much less generously than some other district whose payroll expenditures are lower. So I guess I would put in a plug for not just providing folks with transparency to the raw spending data, although that's useful, but to also provide them with information regarding some of the data that at the very least have been adjusted for regional differences in labor cost.
So let's give Luke and Representative Belton the last word on what they think is important, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Yeah, I would reiterate on your question, I guess, Lisa, about making it accessible. I think we have to remember that the state departments of education or whoever ends up implementing this is not usually very good at making websites that are easily accessible and useful by the public. And so just keep that in mind and know that don't expect your State Department of Ed to go out there and create something that's really beautiful and wonderful and easy to use. It might be with some resources or maybe with some help or coaching or clear direction they can do that, but let's not pretend that you can make it happen just by snapping your fingers. We have a terrible, terrible track record there.
And again, I think that transparency is its own reward. That oftentimes our biggest problem is the people, the conspiracy theories of how we're wasting their money. And the more you show where the money is, we had a businessman who wanted to look at our books and because he thought we were wasting all this money, and he looked at them, and he later on he said, "Oh my God, I can't believe y'all are running this so efficiently." And he was impressed because almost all of our money is spent on salaries. So, I think the more engaged, the more accessible. It's its own reward. It gets people engaged because you can lead the horse to the water, but if you can't make them drink. And I think so much of education's problems is parents not engaging with the children.
Thank you. And I'll just say to close before we take comments that agreeing with what Marguerite said about opening up the discussion and this data being useful, going back to looking at Los Angeles Unified, we found that the principals there, even in what they were calling per pupil schools, had discretion over less than 10% of their budget, and they really didn't have any information about what money was being spent at their school. And even if they were called supposedly student-based budgeting schools, they actually had no information. So not only is it that policymakers or taxpayers or families don't have information, the people that are actually making the instructional decisions don't have the information either about what is happening in a particular school. They might have a vague sense that they don't have as much money as someone else, but they don't actually even know, the people that are making the decisions about our kids, where their resources are going. And you can imagine if you tried to run your family that way, if you had no idea about what you spent on your house payment or your food or any of those decisions. So I think at this point, I'll say again that the Foundation for Excellence in Education has some great model legislation that you should all check out that's available on their website, and we'll take questions now. Thank you so much. And if you could line up at the microphone, and we'll do it that way rather than taking the mic around the room, that would be great.
Don't everybody get up at once now. Ron Sandler from the state of Indiana. We had one district in the state kind of look at this internally, right, with intra-district, and found some inequities persisting from school to school. Oftentimes, I think other people have experienced this driven by programs, but also human capital costs as veteran teachers migrate to certain schools within a certain district. So I'm looking at this opportunity as an opportunity to really drive disruptive change. And I hear conversations like this around iterative conversations about transparency and improvement and tweaking. How can we leverage this data to disrupt some of the institutional barriers to educational equity? And really have a deep conversation to disrupt the status quo and not have a conversation about how are you spending my money.
Well, in some places, it's going to be disruptive, right? But not every district has those patterns. So it's a fascinating thing. So generally speaking, we tend to see in larger districts more senior teachers congregate in schools with more affluent students and draw with them their higher salaries and higher spending, which really is it's interesting. It only works, it only works to spend less on the low income schools because you're spending more on the high income schools, right? Like it comes from somewhere there. And in some districts, when that comes out, that'll be a kind of a strong conversation, I think, that they'll have. And some districts may respond by saying, perhaps next time we negotiate a salary raise, we should put more of that money into our more junior teachers. And that will start in some way to change the teacher salary schedule. So districts might respond in other ways. They don't all have that pattern. Some have figured out how to counteract those salary patterns and still are spending more in their low-income schools, and there'll be examples that others might look to. So I think what happens in each district will be a district-by-district story. So some will be, a slow, steady change over time. Some will be an affirmation of what they've been doing, and some may be, a disruption. And I think that'll be up to that community when they take a look at the data and say, what will we like it to look like?
Yeah, I would just offer that until we have the data, we don't know where all the bodies are buried. We don't know where some of these patterns that are completely indefensible might lie. And I think that knowledge in and of itself can be an incredibly disruptive force. But we shouldn't presume that there has been chicanery or some sort of misallocation of resources. But we need to trust but verify here. We need to find out what's going on at the school level.
Great. I'm going to go to Ben, please.
Ben Scafferty, professor of economics at Kennesaw State and a Friedman Fellow with Ed Choice. You all are all doing great work. Thank you. My question is, how likely is it that states, when they publish this data on spending, are going to include all of it? Things like pensions, debt service, capital, nutrition, OPEB, which is retiree health spending. Because in Georgia, our state DOE hides $3.5 billion a year, and that grows every year. And that's pretty typical among states not reporting total spending. How likely do you think it is going forward that they will?
Well, I would say that the federal law doesn't have a whole lot of language on there. It says there's certain things you have to include. You have to have the real salaries of the teachers who actually work in the building. But what we're finding from the states that I mentioned are in a 38-state working group is a commitment to include it all. Now, the line ends somewhere, right? Because having all the capital costs built into a per pupil really throws off numbers. So there will likely be some set of agreed upon exclusions that are reported separately. But we will surely see some states not do that. And that'll be a great place to say, if you can't compare your data even to the data from the next state over, then they aren't complete. And you want as big and meaningful a capture of this information as possible, so we can have a conversation about what are we spending on pensions, should we think about changing this over time, how does that compare with athletics, what about spending on these other kinds of things. But if some of the money is off the table, then you know it won't be part of the conversation. So it's a thing to watch out for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I actually have two questions. My first is, what always in the back of my head is the statistic that 50% of teachers leave the profession after 5 years or 6 years. And so in the financial analysis, has there been a soft cost placed to that factor? In the sense that there's sort of this quicksand effect going on at the grassroots of teachers coming and leaving, and what is the cost to districts to replace a teacher, to train a teacher, and is that all factored into your financial analysis? That's my first question. And my second question is...
yeah, I think you'll
I'll just ask that one question. Okay.
Yeah, let's start with that one.
does
I
that-
think that's a big enough question to start with.
Okay.
There are a couple pieces to the training costs. One is the cost the individual incurs in getting their bachelor's degree to be trained to become a teacher, and that's not something that gets traced back to the school level. There are hiring costs associated with bringing people on. There are onboarding costs. There are transitional costs. On the other hand, one of the dirty little secrets of ed finance is that the system, through the pension plans, tends to really benefit from all that quick turnover amongst the teachers because they contribute to the pension plan, and the state makes contributions to the pension plan on their behalf, but they haven't vested. And if they're leaving before they vest, then that's to the benefit of those who stay and to the benefit of the finances of the pension plan. So it's very complex to tease out all the dimensions that you're talking about there.
I think I would just point out that when you finally look at it like Maple Leaf Elementary, what do they spend? Surely the district sends some money that it's hard to kind of trace down to the school. Maybe it's HR, maybe it's legal, who knows, right? The superintendent's salary. So what you're likely going to see is kind of how it looks in many of the reports that are showing it. Here's what's spent at Maple Leaf Elementary at the site level, and here's Maple Leaf Elementary's share of these central kind of costs for a grand total of some other number. As soon as that comes out, Maple Leaf's going to go, what? You're charging me part of the HR department because we haven't had a teacher leave in 5 years. And we think that those kind of conversations are healthy. It might be like, what do you mean you're charging me for our share of the district's field trip expenses? Our students don't go on field trips. And you'll have this kind of bottom-up pressure on these central costs. So that may not be your question, but it's a common one that the states are wrestling with. And we say, stick it out there and let them all have that conversation. Because right now, a lot of these costs might be hidden. You know, what does it really cost for a teacher to turn over? You know, it's sort of hard to say because HR departments tend to say the same size, whether the teachers are turning over or not. So it's, you know, that should be open to discussion. I mean, I think you'll find for many of us who really dig into the financials, when teachers stick around longer, those are some really high costs, both between their salaries and the pensions. The lip turnover thing that everybody kind of cries about is a cost saving for the district. It may not be great for the kids, but it's generally one of those things that keeps costs low. But we'll be able to see it.
And we'll be able to see that, so like in this project we just looked at LA, we were surprised at how long most of the teachers had been there, even though the rhetoric is always around this constant turnover, that they have one of the oldest staffs in the United States and that they are costing the district a fortune. So the story, if you actually look at the data, may be completely different than what you're expecting. And I'll also just say that, to Marguerite's point, the state of Hawaii actually gives all the money to each local education agency because they don't have school districts. And it's basically a true student-based budgeting system. And the central office is the state education agency. And because they went through this process, every year they say, what do we have that the state does that we could just give the schools the money? And then they could decide if they want it or not. And so over the last 15 years, the state of Hawaii has really narrowed what they have to spend at a central level for all schools versus how they can just give them the money and then they can decide if they want a share of X, Y, and Z, human resources, athletics, this or that. And so I think ultimately we do want to bring those decisions down to the school level, and knowing what the schools get helps to be able to do that.
Yeah, I'll just share a quick example of that in Colorado. There's a school district called Falcon 49, and they had developed their own local school-based budgeting model that they were using already. And the reason was they have a flipped model where the schools make the decisions and they charge the district services for things that they want. So the district says, here's a menu of things that we'd like, and the local school leader says, yeah, we'll take that, that, and that. And it's only possible if you have an information system to show how that works.
Yeah. Ridgeway?
Falcon 49.
Okay.
Oh, Brett Ridgeway, yeah.
Yeah, right? That's the superintendent
that's
there?
right.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to take these last two questions and then we'll wrap up.
Mine is quick. I'd really just a little bit on the outcome side of this, and what are the common metrics you're using when you get into the outcomes questions? There's a little cognitive dissonance in my mind as I'm hearing about mastery-based education and individualized instruction. There was an earlier panel on this. So what are the common metrics that we're using to get at the outcome side of this?
Well, what we focus in on in the Texas Smart Schools project is to look at a measure of the change in student performance, or to the extent to which the students are outperforming what would have been expected for them given their prior scores and their demographic characteristics. And we think that that's the right way to look at things because it's a flow measure rather than a stock measure of human knowledge. It's going to tell you how they've changed from one year to the next, and you can match that up to the resources that they were exposed to from during that year. And that can be much more informative in my mind than a measure like percent passing, which is going to be a commingling of the stuff I learned in third grade plus the stuff I learned in fourth grade plus the stuff I've learned recently and the stuff I learned at the dinner table. And so it can be, in my mind, what you're trying to do is not to hold the schools accountable, but to help you identify who is getting the job done I would advocate strongly for a value-added metric of some sort.
And I would say the more measures, the better. So you can pick what you want to look at. You want to look at graduation rates. You want to look at second grade reading scores because that's something you've been working on, and you want to compare yourself to your peers. You want to look like maybe in future years we'll have some kind of persistence measure beyond earnings potential. Who knows? But I would say the more options you have for measurements on that left-hand side of that graph, the better.
Anyone else? Okay, last question.
Mine should be very brief. Luke, did you end up giving your website when you were speaking?
Oh, yes. It's Colorado K-12 Financial Transparency. It's a beautiful.
Colorado
Oh, wait, hold on.
K-12
Let me make
Financial
sure.
Transparency.
I have it bookmarked on my thing, so I never type it in. Let me just make sure I give you the right one. I never type it in, so I do that. Gosh, my computer won't open. There we go.
So he's offering to give you his computer. And
Yeah. Sorry, let me. Okay, thank you. I did have it right, okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, well, thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.